Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 11th of September, where I wanted to continue a little bit about laying the foundation for literature and film so that we could actually begin to watch film from an analytic perspective and then transfer those skills into reading some pieces of literature from an analytic perspective. So today's readings that I had assigned from the textbook, and unfortunately, I was not able to find free links for these readings. These are the pieces that were written by the editors themselves, so they're copyright protected. But keep in mind that there is a copy of the book on reserve in the GCC library that you can photocopy and that you can also scan as well. But I wanted to talk about writing about fiction and the writing process. And hopefully, this is a bit of a review based on what you would have learned in English 101. I have a handout that I have posted in our syllabus and other documents folder that I will be reviewing entitled Writing About Film. There is a glossary that I wanted you to skim, not read, but skim at the back of the book so that you would know that you have that reference available to you. And I wanted to lay the foundation for the first film we will be seeing, which is Citizen Kane. So I had some documentary elements that I wanted you to view about Citizen Kane. There is a wonderful documentary entitled The Battle Over Citizen Kane that I highly recommend. But what I've done is I've just selected segments from that documentary for us to watch. But first, if you'll look at the notes below, there's a picture. You might recognize the picture, actually. It's from Stanley Kubrick's Stephen King film, The Shining. And I find this to be quite fascinating because it really illustrates how deliberate filmmaking and story-taking is, or at least it is by the masters. So if you happen to know anything about The Shining, then you happen to know that a hedge maze plays a very important role in the film. And I encourage you to watch the film. And in fact, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the Garden Cinema in downtown Greenfield is doing a Stephen King Film Fest over the next several weeks. And one of the films that they are showing is The Shining. Well, the first image below you can see is of the main character, whose name is Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson. And he is wearing a tie, and you wouldn't think much of this tie unless you looked at the close-up of the tie. It's a green tie that has a grid to it. And if you look at the picture below that, we've got Jack Torrance. At this point, he's becoming increasingly unhinged, and he's looking at the maze of the hedge that is outside of the locale where they are staying, which happens to be the Overlook Hotel. So the tie basically mimics the grid of the hedges, which is a little bit of foreshadowing. In other words, it's a hint of something that's going to be important later on. It's something that the director did visually that we probably wouldn't even register on a conscious level. But if we were to pay very, very close attention to the film after multiple watchings, we might be able to see that. This was a very deliberate choice. So I use that as an example about what I talk about in terms of reading a film, that you can pay as close attention to a film and analyze it and dissect it in the way that you would with a piece of literature. So going back to the textbook readings, there's a section about writing about fiction where you're offered a list of questions about things like plot and character and setting and symbolism and theme and style and tone and irony. Some of the literary things that we've talked about over the course of the semester. And we will be talking about plot, for instance, is just what is the action. And that perhaps is the least important thing, but you need to try to determine plot before you can do anything else, because without plot, you can't analyze anything else. So first, you need to determine what's happening. Then, more importantly, you have to determine why are those things happening. That's what's more interesting. And the why is illustrated through things like who the characters are, how they present themselves, how they speak. Do they speak differently from one another or not? Do they change over the course of the story? Or do they basically remain the same? Are they characters that have a certain level of depth and complexity? Or are they pretty flat and stereotypical? The setting. Where is the story taking place? And that can be very important, particularly if we're given lots of details about the setting. Usually, if we're given information in a film or in a text, it's going to be important. I mean, there is such a thing as Hitchcock's MacGuffin, where you're given a misdirection, a piece of information that you think is going to be important, and it's really not, to throw you off. But the reality is that if you happen to see something that, for instance, let's say a gun in a movie or read about it in a text, it's probably going to be an important element later on in the text. So the same with setting. If we aren't given a setting, it's probably not that important. But if we are given a setting, why that particular setting? And how would things change if it was placed in a different setting? And the setting can be a season, it could be a locale, it could be a time of day, all of the above, perhaps. Symbolism, something that's representational, which I believe we had talked about last class. So oftentimes it's something that is abstract, that is symbolized or represented by something concrete. So the example I oftentimes use is that patriotism, an abstract concept, is symbolized by a very concrete object, or can be symbolized by a very concrete object. A flag, for instance. And sometimes the symbolism is obvious, but sometimes the author or the filmmaker will utilize symbolism in really unusual and unexpected ways. The theme, what is the major moral or lesson? And oftentimes there are multiples in a film or in a piece of literature. The style. Is it comedic? Is it dramatic? All of that is also related to tone as well. What kind of language is used and why. Um, Irony, which we had talked a little bit about last class, I believe, where you get something that's unexpected but with a twist. So, for instance, a fire station burning down. And it even talks about critical strategies, which we had talked about last class, about different lenses you could use to focus on a text. So you might be a biographical critic and you focus on author biography, or you might be a psychological critic. So what you are focusing on is the psychology of either the author or the characters or the readers. And I suggest and continue to suggest that you don't pick one particular style of literary interpretation and do that for every text you read. Instead, you do it the other way around. You read the text or you watch the film, but watching a film is very much like reading a film. And then you determine which literary strategy, which critical strategy lends itself best to an interpretation of that text. And chances are you could utilize multiples. On page 50, and this might be something that you might want to dog ear. This is on page 50 of the edition of the text that I had ordered for us. There is a sample paper in progress. And what you can see is that this is done in stages. And that really is the best way to write a paper rather than trying to write it all in one sitting or immediately the night before it's due. You're almost always setting yourself up for frustration and difficulty when you're doing that. You get a much better product if you can do it in pieces over time. And they suggest that you might want to do some informal writing first, some note taking or some journaling. A journal is like keeping a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you're writing about the text. And then some brainstorming where you're trying to just generate ideas and there's no rhyme or reason to them. They don't have to be evaluated in any way as good or bad. And then you do drafting. You begin to write out sentences, but you're not worried about grammar or mechanics. It's only at the editing stage that you're worried about the polishing and the grammar and the mechanics, so that finally that you can submit in the paper. So we will revisit this as we talk a little bit more about paper number 1 and paper 2 over the course of the semester. And that said, the section on the reading and writing process is probably also, that sounds somewhat familiar if you've taken previous English classes, that we will also revisit over the course of the semester. That you've got your first task to read The second, to discuss, which is what this is, and our discussion forums are. And then lastly, writing about the text. A lot of different ways you can do this. You can do this through annotating, taking notes in the text. There is no right or wrong way to take notes. Ultimately, what you're doing is taking notes for yourself. Um, Journals, as I had indicated, oftentimes illustrate reactions and reflections, and they're examples of both, but these are merely examples. You don't have to carbon copy them. Um, Carbon copy is a very old term of what we used to use when we needed to make duplicates. We would use carbon paper to make a copy. So now I show my age here by using that term. And then the text also talks about papers where you have to think about your topic, which is a general idea, and then your thesis is a specific position upon which reasonable people disagree. And the textual evidence you're going to provide to support your position. In many ways, you're like an attorney putting together an argument. So all good attorneys could probably argue either defense or prosecution with the same pieces of evidence. Obviously, some pieces of evidence might be stronger on one side than another, but a good lawyer can do a decent job on with either position. And that's what you basically are doing, is that you're looking for evidence within the text to support your particular position. And it's a position that could be debated, but as long as it's possible, it doesn't even have to be probable, certainly doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt, then you're fine. And then after you've gathered your elements, you think about things like how are you going to organize all of these elements, your drafting, your quoting, your revising, and your editing. And there are examples of that as well in the reading that I had assigned, but I'm also going to revisit this when we start talking about paper number 1. And then I had assigned a handout, which is in our syllabus and other documents folder that I'm going to be covering, about how to write about film, which in some ways is similar. So this might be a handout that you might want to make a copy of. I'm always encouraging students to take hard copies of important elements in an online class. And I just wanted to go through just a few pieces of this handout that, unlike when you write about a written text, it might be easier to get lost in a film and lose track of considering the film critically, because we usually watch films just for entertainment, not necessarily for academic analysis. So maybe the most common type of film writing is a movie review, when someone determines if the film is positive or negative, good or bad. That is a kind of writing. It's not necessarily the kind of writing that we are going to do from an academic perspective. Usually you find that kind of writing in popular media. And then what usually happens is that you have critical writing, which is very similar to the critical writing you do with written literature, where you're doing analysis based on the text itself. And films can be analyzed through lots of different lenses as well, that this handout talks about. Formalism, genre, historical, national cinema, auteur, and ideology. Okay, so it talks a little bit about the movie review, and that it's not usually something that you do in an academic setting. Might see it in a newspaper or in a magazine. And it's tailored for the widest possible audience, to either recommend a film or to discourage someone from seeing it. The critical essay. Now, this is something we do in academia with literature and with film, that it assumes the reader has seen or is familiar with the film being discussed. So you don't have to do a summary of the text, whether you're writing a critical essay for literature or a critical essay for film. What you're doing is providing key details and themes that are relevant to your argument, but you're not going into lengthy summaries. You're focusing on the analysis on a sequence or a scene that might have escaped viewers on a first viewing. And you can focus on lots of different things, such as formalism, the formal structure of a work, just like the formalists do this with literature. So you're looking at the style, but that said, you can also combine it with other approaches, just like you can do with literary criticism. So you're looking at what happens on the screen, and asking questions like, what is the most interesting and significant thing about this film or an element of the film, and how do these elements add to the story. And then if you're looking at a particular scene or sequence, how do things like the lighting or the sound or the editing or the cinematography contribute to or impact the meaning of the film. Now, you can also look at a genre. A genre is a category, common patterns of form. And it could be a content, so it could be, let's say, a narrative, or it could be a particular kind of film, a romance, let's say, as opposed to horror. And how do all of these elements conform to that category of genre? Always think about the moment of time that the film is addressing, just like always think about the moment of time that the piece of literature is addressing, because all of these pieces are products of their time. They were not done for our time, they were done for their time, though that's not to say that they can't be timeless and universal and still be applicable. And if you're thinking about genre, when did this genre first appear, and does it conform to expectations? That's the whole point of a genre, is that it has certain expectations associated with it. You can examine the historical elements of the film, maybe a unique historical moment of the film's content. Again, you can do this as well with literature, as we talked about with historical critics. You can ask yourself, how are historical events depicted in the film? Is this film a representation of its time? Is it set in the past? Is it set in the future? Same sorts of questions you can ask yourself with reading a piece of literature. How does knowing the historical background of the time help explain the narrative or the technique? So, now, in terms of film, you also get to think about things like technology, because ultimately, in the early days of film, they didn't have the kind of technology that we've got today. So you want to make sure that you are also considering what were the technological limits of the time and what were some of the technical innovations of the time. You can think about an ideology of a film, which is basically the politics of the film. What message is it giving about society or culture or gender? What kind of social commentary is it offering? And you can use, again, many of the elements that we were talking about earlier. You can view it from a feminist perspective, or you can view it from a post-colonial perspective. There's lots of different perspectives that you can do them, and you can mix and match. So, I talk about this, and even the idea of the theoretical essay, again, I'm not asking you to use outside resources. So you're not really being asked to think about the films that we're watching in the context of national cinema as a whole. But that said, if you really are a film buff and you have a specific idea about film that you think you might want to examine in an academic paper, you can certainly run it by me. I'm going to be providing you with some sample paper topics soon that you can pursue, or you can create your own, just as long as you get your own topic approved by me. So there are lots of different ways that we can go about doing this, whether you want to think about the cultural conditions of the film, what is the meaning of the film when it's viewed outside of its culture, what about the director of the film, the producer, the actors, so asking yourself questions, I suppose, is probably the biggest thing when you are reading literature or watching film. That's the most important, or one of the most important things you can do when you are engaging in literary and cinematic criticism. So I thought this handout might be useful for you. It very much, I think, it repeats many of the same things that we were talking about with literature, but just with the focus on film itself. So you'll see that beneath that, I've got several clips for you to watch. It's approximately 40 minutes in their entirety, so I'm going to stop my commentary very soon so that you can watch these 40 minutes from the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane. Now, Citizen Kane is going to be the first film that we're going to watch. We're going to actually watch it twice. The first time, we're just going to watch it and consume it as a film. The second time, you're going to watch it with commentary by Roger Ebert, who you may have heard of before. He is a great a great literary critic, and but more importantly, a great film critic. And he's able to combine the two genres together very nicely. And he went through Citizen Kane, scene by scene, shot by shot, talking about how and why it's important. And I can share with you my own experiences with watching Citizen Kane. That when I first started watching Citizen Kane, I would say I was a freshman in college, and it was assigned in an English class. This is pretty typical. It was at maybe my second or my third week in the semester. So around the same time that you are at, except again, this was my first semester in college. And we were told it was a great film and an important film. And I remember watching it afterwards thinking, well, I guess, but I didn't really understand what I'd seen. It was only after the fact that I really learned about the history of the film, and I really learned about some of its cinematic techniques that I understood. Now it's definitely one of my favorite films, and I can tell you I've watched this film dozens of times, and every time I watch it, I find something new. So, part of the problem, I think, with Citizen Kane is that I didn't understand the story upon which it was based. So, this is what the Battle of Citizen Kane is about, is that it tells you a little bit about the director of the film, Orson Welles, who also has the star role, and how Orson Welles worked with a screenwriter by the name of Mankiewicz, and Mankiewicz came up with a very loosely veiled critique of one of the richest men in America at the time, William Randolph Hearst. Incredibly powerful, incredibly rich, and a media mogul. And what they ended up doing was Mankiewicz and Orson Welles wrote a screenplay entitled Citizen Kane that was in many ways a biography of William Randolph Hearst. Yes, there are differences, but there are more similarities than differences, so that anybody seeing that film could see that it was probably an expose on William Randolph Hearst. And when William Randolph Hearst people saw that film, when it was initially screened, they did everything in their power to get that film killed and to stop it from being shown. And they were unsuccessful, luckily, or else we wouldn't have this film today. But what they did do was they found a way to destroy Orson Welles and his career afterwards. He was basically blacklisted. And Orson Welles was up and coming. He was a radio actor who had achieved great fame with a radio broadcast that you might have heard of that I talk about in my media and popular culture class. And the radio broadcast is War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, no relation to Orson Welles, about Martians invading the Earth. The radio broadcast that Orson Welles gave was an adaptation of War of the Worlds, but what he ended up doing was making it sound like it was a news broadcast happening over live time. And individuals who tuned into that radio broadcast, again, you have to remember the early time period. So we're talking about there wasn't access to television at that point. Individuals basically responded with panic, and there are all kinds of news stories about how people thought what they were listening to was true. There were traffic jams and lots of calls to the police, and churches and synagogues were filled, and there are even incidents of stories of people who committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide because they thought that that would be a better fate than being enslaved by Martians. Now, Orson Welles had to answer to this because it turns out, if you watch the documentary in its entirety, he knew what was happening, and he continued on with his broadcast, which was a Halloween broadcast. So he said he had intended to scare his audience, and oh boy, did he. And what he ended up getting out of this was not a prison sentence, which he could have, but he ended up getting a movie contract where he could basically do anything he wanted. He was very young, early 20s. So basically, he was known as the Boy Wonder. And this is where you are going to begin to hear about Orson Welles, and also you will hear about William Randolph Hearst and his estate, and how basically that estate is portrayed in the screenplay Citizen Kane. So I've got you watching a section about 1939 to give you an idea of around the time period of when Citizen Kane was being produced. San Simeon, that's the estate that William Randolph Hearst lived on, that you will see loosely referenced in a Citizen Kane. The newsman Hearst, so we'll hear about how he bought up all of these newspapers and media outlets, and we'll see that in Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane does the same thing. We'll hear about Hearst having political ambitions, and in Citizen Kane, we'll see that the lead character, Citizen Kane, has political ambitions. We will see how Hearst failed in his political ambitions, and in the movie Citizen Kane also fails. We'll learn about Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, who is loosely portrayed in Citizen Kane as Susan. We'll learn a little bit about Mankiewicz, who was the individual who was friends with the Hearsts, who went to many of their dinner parties and basically observed all of the elements that he needed to create a screenplay with Orson Welles that basically was an expose about the Hearsts. We'll talk about how the scripting occurred. We'll talk about how the production occurred. We'll talk about how Hearst people saw the film and tried to kill it. We'll talk about how Hearst tried to label Orson Welles as a communist, amongst other things, in terms of destroying Orson Welles' reputation and career. And then we'll talk about how the film was almost destroyed, but not. And that will at least give you a little bit of background for when we watch Citizen Kane starting next class. So what's left is today's attendance question, because I wanted to leave you with watching these clips. This will be due on Friday, the 13th. Again, if you need additional time, just let me know. And that said, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. You'll get an idea of the class discussion. So, after you watch the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane, what was one of the most interesting things you learned in The Battle Over Citizen Kane, and why? What was one of the most interesting things you learned in that documentary, that 40 minutes I'm going to have you watch, and why? So I'm curious to read your answers. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about, well, Citizen Kane. Take care. Bye-bye.